I'm drawing this church in the Tasmanian town of Bothwell using a 0.2mm Copic multiliner. I'm drawing it freehand in ink without any pencil guidelines. It took me 35 minutes to draw in real time, to draw the outline that I'm doing now, and then it was another 7 minutes using sketch marker to apply a bit of value in a fairly simplified way to the line drawing. The first point I would recommend to really focus on with architecture is to make sure that you're ready to draw all your vertical lines vertically, and that once they've been drawn, they are in fact vertical. Over and over again with architecture, I see lines that are clearly meant to be vertical, leaning one way or another, not necessarily even in the same direction. It's very off-putting to our being able to appreciate architectural drawings when something so fundamentally unsettling as lines being uneven, not being vertical, are there. That's the first thing. Work really hard to maintain straightness, and part of that is making sure the paper doesn't slip. Sometimes the paper will twist slightly, and that will throw out, or the reference photo will twist slightly, and that will throw out of kilter our perception of where vertical is, shifted, if you like, halfway through the drawing. So need to be really careful with that. Now, the second one is to establish scale and then to keep everything in proportion. Buildings are often familiar things, but even if they're not specifically familiar, we have a sense of scale because people use them. We have a sense of scale of doors and window size according to walls and the number of levels depending on the type of architecture it is. And so we want to make sure that we capture the correct scale. Now, scale is simply the size we draw something in relation to what it is. So the scale of this is many times less than the actual church, but it's approximately the same scale as the photo reference that I'm using. Keeping the scale is what I draw being consistent across the whole drawing. But I've also got to focus on proportion in all the small parts, which is a related term and are often used interchangeably. But proportion is the ratio between, say, height and width. That proportion should be the same regardless of the scale that we're drawing with. So whatever I draw, once I've drawn it, I take great care to make sure that the proportions of the parts are all equal, that the scale of what I've drawn is consistent with the scale I'm using with the whole photo. Thirdly, I need to make sure that the parts that aren't architecture get as much attention at whatever stage in my drawing process I need to draw them. Now, in this case, it's going to be the trees on each peripheral side and this fence down in the lower right. We are going to be drawing the architecture first, but that's often not the case. There may be a tree that's quite close to the foreground that comes in front of our main subject, and therefore I'll need to at least start to draw that in some way so I know where to position the architecture behind. And the important thing is that at whatever stage in the drawing that we draw the things that aren't the main subjects, so I think of them as the support acts, that whenever we draw the support acts, that we take as much care, put as much effort into doing them well, using the same sorts of thinking and process and strategies as we do for the main event, for the star of the drawing, in this case, the architecture, the church. Vertical lines, but also straight lines as well. Lines that are meant to be straight, we need to learn from a technique point of view how to do fairly quick, brisk, almost flicking-like lines that are often so much straighter than ones that we go slowly and try and take care with. That often ends up just causing a wavering to happen. Now, you're watching this at 3 times my actual drawing speed. So if you want to slow it down, you can use the cog icon that you can see around the screen and take it down back to half speed, which will be only slightly faster than my actual drawing speed. Now, The fourth point, as we watch this demo, is the perspective angles. And the perspective angles are, if you like, the horizontal lines that go across a building, or things that line up, parts of the decoration that line up on a horizontal line. Because when a building's twisted away from us, we see the closest end larger than we see the further end, because any object, the further away it gets, becomes smaller. When that object is one very large object, the further half will be smaller than the closer half, and that creates these sloping lines, sloping up and sloping down. We need to make sure we get those angles correct, and there is no sloping line at the eye level of the person looking at the scene or the level of the camera lens that took the photo. That line is a horizontal line. Above it, the horizontal lines start to angle slightly one way, and below it, they angle slightly the other way. Most commonly, the lines angle mostly in one direction, above or below eye level. In this case, eye level is quite low down on the church. I took this photo. The ground is sloping down away from the church, so I'm a little bit lower than if I'd been next to the church. If we find the line that slopes, horizontal line that slopes up, one that slopes down, eye level is somewhere in between. Now, the fifth point, the fifth thing when we draw architecture we need to look out for is what I call the depth lines. Now, the depth lines are the lines that indicate part of the structure is three-dimensional, that it's not like a cartoon drawn on the outside of the building, that in fact parts of now this form are inset. And so the window isn't stuck onto the outside of the wall, but it's set back. And often structural parts of the window, framing and the glass, are set back even further. And when we look not straight on at a building, we see on either the left side or the right side these depth lines, depending which angle we're viewing from. If we're low down, we'll see these depth lines with horizontal lines that are above eye level. If we are looking down, we'll see horizontal lines on the bottom parts of forms and structures and window openings if they're below eye level. We need to bear in mind these depth lines, and that even with a fairly quick, brisk style of drawing, as we see here, and even if all of the line work is deliberately loose and fresh, that we still include enough lines that there's a sense, a feel, if not the accuracy of a depth line there. Often, rather than trying to draw a line, trying to create a shadow with our pen is a better way, more effective way, that we can create more effect more accurately in a narrower band that way than trying to draw the outlines of the depth. And then the final point is, when we're drawing architecture, we're not just drawing the parts and the shapes that make it up, but we're creating an overall form. We're creating an overall three-dimensional form. And not every part of this form visually will be having the same impact. Some parts will be clearer or less clear, or brighter or darker. Some detail will be in greater clarity than other details. And so we need to be thinking of this with our line work, with the marks that we make. And if I focus on just drawing one shape after another shape, without any regard for the whole structure, it can end up being very cartoon-like, very flat, and look a bit like a jigsaw puzzle of shapes, rather than something that is three-dimensional in a very significant way. With these fences, what I did was I lined up what I'm drawing with what I've already drawn using the reference. So all the verticals on this fence I line up with the architecture above, firstly in the reference, and that shows me where to put it in my drawing. It would have been very easy to get the foreshortening of this row of fences incorrect, to not tighten them enough, to in effect to have less in there, because I don't make them short enough or narrow enough quickly enough as they move to the right. So by cross-referencing where they are in the photo according to the architecture I've already drawn, I can make sure I position my lines accurately. And I also have to make sure, of course, that they do get shorter as they move further away, because, as I said before, as things move away from us, they become smaller. And so perspective affects everything, whether it's a timber low fence or whether it's grand architecture or even a tree. Once we understand the principles in general terms, we can start to see how it works. So by now I've worked out that I'm going to use some Copic sketch markers, neutral grey colour, to add a bit of value for this. It is a very sunny day, but our subject is largely backlit, and I didn't want to leave it just as a blank drawing. Makes it look like it's out of a colouring in book. So I wanted to give some sense that it's backlit, and also to create a stronger sense of the bright sunlight on the right-hand side of the church. So I get my markers. I start with an N2, which is the third grade of value, third lightest grade, and I discovered that because I haven't used them for quite some time, they've sort of all dried out. So I tried a couple of different ones here, and then I, in the end, gave up. It was all looking very streaky, and I couldn't get the darkness I wanted. So I pulled the pens apart and refilled them, which is one of the advantages of the Copic sketch markers. Gave them a few minutes just for that ink to settle back down to the brush end, and then I resumed. So I messed up the base of the church a little bit. You may have noticed with that horizontal banding, just in the end didn't observe carefully enough and lost track with what I was looking at in the reference and where I was drawing it in the photo, and so I got an extra horizontal line, which also throws out the feel of the proportions as well. It's always important at the end of a drawing to look at it and to ask, has it worked? Are there any things that I would like to focus on if I were to do it again? And I look at this and I think, well, I feel like my tower is slightly too wide for the height, so I'd work at keeping it just a little bit tighter. And I also used an N1, N3 and N4 pens, and I used some of the value to emphasize the hatching that I've done on the foliage. Foliage is a tremendous advantage to have in an architecture drawing. See how it makes the building pop out and really snap much more than it was doing before? So if foliage isn't there in life, it's something we might like to consider adding into our drawing. So therefore we need to learn to do it as well as we learn to do our architecture. And the marks we use with foliage are in such contrast to the marks we use for architecture that, again, it really, I think, creates visual interest in what we look at and helps almost frame at times to direct our attention, make it easier to enter and explore the building. So now I've filled the pens and you can see there's a lot more ink coming out of them now, so just giving this another working over. So it was about 7 minutes of using the sketch markers. You really only need to have 3, 4, 5 to be able to create some quite realistic effects. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Well, have you found this? Why not give architecture a go drawing? You'll find this photo on my channel community page if you want to have a go, or you can find any architecture you want and draw that. But whatever you do, have fun. Bye.